Sai usare il Mac?
Dimmi, vediamo.
Senti, potresti fare copia di questo indirizzo?
Sì, subito. Una cosa così la so fare. E dove te la devo mettere il copia? Su un'altra pagina?
Se riusciamo a entrare dentro Facebook l'indirizzo di prezzo
quindi dobbiamo entrare tramite quindi dobbiamo uscire da...
No.
Ah, ok.
Le password
No, infatti noi dobbiamo uscire. Cioè, non riesco a vedere dove fa esci qua. No, dove si fa esci? Oddio. Non so come faccio a fare esci.
Vai qua dentro dove c'è l'occhietto.
E dove te la devo mettere? No, forse c'è un'altra pagina.
Sì, esci. Scusa, lo faccio fare a te perché...
Facciali per
quanto dire.
Quindi dobbiamo fare tramite quindi dobbiamo uscire da...
Cos'è che sta andando? Scusa.
Secondo me sta andando...
Ah, perché sta andando questo, aspetta, questo lo... Un attimo, prof.
Un attimo.
Allora, ok, ti diamo il benvenuto, qui è lento. Senti, invece, se mi facessi un favore no. Lo fai un favore no?
Sì. Devo fare.
In qualche modo, pubblica questo indirizzo, anche scrivendolo a mano.
Che vuol dire
su Facebook, su Facebook.
E come faccio? No, ma soprattutto non ho il modo per andare su in rete.
Perché non lo posso capire incollare e mandarglielo perché è tutta la rete popolare, quindi non è lentissimo.
E non riusciamo neanche ad andare su Facebook, è assurdo. Proviamo di nuovo, se no faccio la vediamo. Ok, com'è?
Allora, press-letter. Gmail.
Con 2 S, no? Oddio, aspetta, questa qua è diversa dalla mia. Ok.
Gmail.com.
Ok.
E Luan.
Tutto minuscolo?
Tutto minuscolo, scritto Lu. 2 0 1.
Vai. Guardate che ce la facciamo. Salve.
Adesso scrivi.
Cosa stai iniziando?
Sì, cosa pensavo? Seguite la diretta streaming di
Qui con stampadello?
Streaming, sì, grazie. Di meeting Architects Meet il fuoribiennale.
Sta tastiera.
Ok, e pubblicare il link con le link. Perfetto.
Aspetta. Lo levo perché fa che... No? Pubblico.
Ah, ok. L'importante è che ti rimane il link.
Sì, in teoria è così, fai, è così, dovrebbe andare, poi controlliamo, ma io faccio sempre così quando metto un link, che poi levo...
Ok. Perfetto, fantastico, sei un angelo. Grazie.
No, addirittura, perché sono pubblica.
Fidati. Mannaggia i cosi, mannaggia i Mac maledetti. Giulia. Vabbè, quello. Bravissimo.
Dario, vai.
Juliet, hai 15. Sì, di venire. Un attimo.
Io ho fatto.
Allora, buongiorno a tutti, welcome to everybody. English is the most thing in the world, but I have to introduce all our guests. This event will last until 9 o'clock with some of the most interesting foreign critics, architects, and thinkers. The first who have to speak, now, with the floor, to break the floor, is Indira Kloster. Indira is the editor of A10, that is the European magazine, one of the most interesting experiments in new magazines, because the editors came from all over Europe. Indira, please come here and tell us what is your keyword.
Thank you, Luigi. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I think we need another presentation. Yes, the one next to. That's the one. Yeah. So my keyword would be reactivate, and to specialize, especially after having seen the fundamentals biennale, I thought to add one more keyword, which is public space, and I will try to explain a bit more about that. I wrote a book, Reactivate, which was about a group of Dutch architects, about 40 practices, really young architects that are trying to expand the borders of the profession by finding new ways of being an architect. As well, in many countries in Europe, there's hardly any money left, there aren't any clients, so if you want to be an architect, you have to find other ways. And for example, by co-working with the public or with the clients, or by finding your own clients, by doing pop-up temporary stuff, and I collected a few of them. And it was actually a book that had explained in a lot of words that are no longer relevant, we think, which are off words, and the words that could be replaced by other words. A10 is a magazine, it's about 10 years old now, and it appears every 2 months. Downstairs we have 3 copies, so if you're quick, maybe you can get your own copy and have a look at it, how it looks. What is interesting, it has a network of 70 correspondents all over Europe, about 2 or 3 in every country, and they send us the most important projects from their country every 2 months, and then we make a selection. And this kind of taught us, or taught me during the almost 3 years that I'm editor-in-chief of A10, how big the difference actually are between different countries, and how difficult it is to speak of one European theme. But I think that maybe the one thing that connects us all is public space. This is, for example, one of the things we do in the magazine. It's called Europe Today, in which we try to kind of summarize what happened in Europe in the last 2 months. And that's one way to look at Europe. Another way to look at Europe, which we very much like, is to put the map upside down, because then we see completely different relationships between the various countries and their respective places in the world. Of course, we can also look at it by a political point of view, and the recent elections that just have happened, we can see how the whole circus is moving a bit more to the red part, actually, to the center, and to the socialists and the Democrats, and to the left and the kind of right wing. But still, you can see on this map the great differences in all the different countries, which of course is perfectly understandable. Just one way to show how different actually Europe is this collection of maps. It's by a Bulgarian guy. Let me see. This chunk of Yanko Chekhov. It's called The Atlas of Prejudice, and it's really very interesting research he's been doing over the years. And I'm going to show you a few words that he has, the research that he has done, actually database research on how the countries look upon each other. And I've circled Italy because that's where we are now. So here you can see what the Swiss, for example, think of Italy, which is third world. But then, if you look at the Turks, it says Anatolia, Romania. Then the Russians think it's mostly a shopping center. then the Germans think it's most likely to send the museums. In Greek, in plagiarists, they copied everything we already had. And so this kind of explains or illustrates how different views are of countries. If you look at these maps to the other countries, it's really fascinating stuff to see. And another way, of course, to look at Europe is to see the population of architects per thousand inhabitants. And here you can see that Portugal and Italy have quite a lot of architects, which of course we already knew, which is also part of the problem. Then let's go on from what we can do in these times with all the political shifts and money and going elsewhere or just evaporated. And then if you look at the Ukraine, for example, you can see how public space gets a kind of, well, let's say, macabre and almost meaning. But still, and I'll get back to that later, even in the Ukraine and in Kiev mostly, there are still at this moment architects working on the quality of public space, because one of the ways actually to involve the people and to teach them, especially in Ukraine, which is of course a long time governed by the Russians, they have to kind of learn how to use their own space. Same thing might apply for Bulgaria, where we had all the protests last year. And we just did a special in Bulgaria. It was really fascinating to see how architects there cannot get access to the networks, so the old boys network, let's say, of the high-placed politicians or mayors or the industrialists, the clients. So they have to find other ways of being an architect. And they find many of their projects can be done actually in public space by revising a bathhouse or by refurbishing a bar they actually also run by themselves, or by doing other interior stuff that can also be temporary. And then, while marching the streets, they said, we actually rediscovered the value and the importance of public space, because while we were going there and marching there every night and again, it taught us also how we can, how the public space is actually ours, how we can make of it what we want it to be. In Portugal, we have a completely different situation. It's still similar in the way that financials are really bad there. The Portuguese government actually urges the architects to leave the country. They say, no work here, go elsewhere, please go. And the youngest generation of Portuguese architects decided to stay, because what they said literally was, okay, there is no money. They can reach to the left or to the right, and they can see what needs to be done here in the city, here in these apartments, here in these neighborhoods. So that also they, as all kinds of temporary projects, or working in different neighborhoods, or setting up temporary communities to actually kind of lock into local economy and also create things that are maybe beyond architecture, that are more like creating communities and creating public space. In Turkey, of course, and if you've seen the Biennale exhibition, the Arsenale this time, you can see that what they did was to actually to write out the history of that specific building, which is really, really interesting, because it started in a commission of a 19th century opera house, and then all kind of things went wrong. And then in the end, this is what came up, the Aperture Cultural Center. And then, of course, the story ends with all the banners that were hanging over this building. Of course, you know the images when the protests at Taksim Square were taking place. And then, what's interesting about this is that the riots actually started because of a small park, kind of a neglected park actually, but only by the time that all these people got together there, the park had a different meaning. And suddenly people were going there, doing yoga classes, meeting, talking, demonstrating. So again, they were kind of re-evaluating public space. That's a way of reactivating, which is why my word is reactivate. And to see it in a bit broader view, I think that we need to understand today that this, of course, is architecture. But if we want to understand architecture today, we can no longer suffice with this kind of architecture. Modernist architecture would have one client and one architect and one building. It's also not this iconographic huge buildings that kind of drop down somewhere without paying any attention to the context. This might be a good example of how we can actually look at public space about the new role of architects, which is a project by SUS Architects from the Netherlands in Rotterdam, and they actually get started. Do you know which one is the important? This one? Yes, it is. So there was this in the city center of Rotterdam. This building was actually empty, and they just started by reprogramming this building by getting new small practices there, artists, architects, filmmakers and stuff, and they put this roof on top of it, and then they started building this bridge. And of course, you cannot just start building a bridge, and there was no money either. But they started by crowdfunding it. And you could buy just one piece of wood for 25 euros. And then we could buy a bigger piece or a very big piece, like a modular piece. And by that, they raised about 300,000 euros. And by that time, the municipality was quite convinced that maybe there was some ground to do this. And then they supplied the rest of the money. And from there, they still going on, trying to reactivate the rest of the public space that comes next. The whole yellow line is what they're gradually trying to recapture. And I think when I asked them, so why do you think this happened? Why are you doing this? And then they said, well, we made this design and we had this idea, but we didn't want to wait for 30 years before all the regulations had come through, before we could finally start building it. So we just started. And we connected the public and the people to help us. But we didn't ask them, what would you like us to do? We just tried to persuade them to be a part of it and to actually, let's say, adopt the project. And that's maybe, I think, one of the key words of how you could work. So if we would talk about new European architecture, which is, let's say, not established architecture, but young upcoming practices, it's usually low budget, it's in public space, it relates to communal values. It has some political implications, although that's different in every country. And it also involves new clients, institutions, foundations, private clients, really different fields, no longer the official governmental client, for example. And nothing is inspired self-financed. So what's important here, and I think we have three important theorists about it, Cedric Price, Leon Daniel. What they all said is, if you want to talk about architecture, we may not be looking for buildings, actually. We may have to look beyond the building, and maybe we can use our architectural skills in another way and not make buildings out of them. And this applies actually to both the very rich countries. In Finland, this is a library, probably you know it. It's by AOA architects, and they are really, really very young practice. In Finland, they have this competition system that really works well. So for Finnish architects, it's fairly usual to have a first commission being a library or a concert hall or a school. And this is a first project from AOA architects. And why this is also related to public spaces, because it's not only the library, it connects to the subway system, it connects to the shopping mall, and it connects to the street. And the other end is, as I told you earlier, in Kiev, which was a workshop that ended only 2 weeks ago, where architects from all over the world actually came to Kiev to talk about it, which is an old factory area that was started by the Russians as kind of an assemblage factory, and now with the whole network factories being done, the whole area as such became obsolete and outdated. So they're looking for new ways to actually revive this area, because it's really close to the riverside, and it could be a very valuable public space if designed on properly. So I'm going to show you now just a few examples from all over Europe, which at some point relate to how you can rethink, reactivate public space without actually using much money or having important, let's say, not important, but you know, like big clients. For example, in Spain, there is the architecture school in Barcelona, and they are trying to find ways to actually find a way to make buildings and living self-sufficient, which has partly to do with the fact that it's really difficult for Spanish architects to get to the usual systems network of clients. So for Spanish people, it's quite common actually to try and create their own communities. And here it's a group of architects financed by the architecture school to think about growing their own food, making their own products by the Flat Lab in Barcelona, which is one of the biggest in Europe, and also by making their own circular systems in gaining water and putting on making electricity, etc. And they have this old villa just about 20 kilometers outside Barcelona. And there they are trying to experiment. They're experimenting actually on what you can do when you get off the grid. Another way could be in Serbia, where you have this small project, and I want to include a picture of the architect, which is really for the average, because he is also designing his own clothes. You can see the sleeves of his shirt, how he actually feels about fashion. But what he did here is this bench in the park, and on this bench there is this railing, and on it you have all kinds of adapters. So when you're in the park, you can actually recharge your mobile phone with the solar panel that's on top of it. Or an island where you have these telephone booths that are no longer used, that can be redesigned as public spaces, places to convene, to meet, and to actually get together again. Or here in Lithuania, where there is a big area just around the city center that has stopped being developed because of the financial situation. And now it's a temporary pop-up community for kitesurfers, because it's one of the best kitesurfing places in Europe. So you have this container city where people live and sleep, and there are shops there and spaces where during the summer they actually stay. Or in Spain, you can revive obsolete buildings like 19th century slaughterhouses or stations or factories by not really doing the building as such, but by creating temporary structures that can actually be used to do gatherings again. Or here in Denmark, I really like this one also because it's done by an architect without any client and without any money actually. Just made it by itself, and it's kind of an illegal structure, and it's just a place to sit on your own somewhere in the harbour front of Denmark. And as far as I know, it's still being there. So somehow nobody found any reason to take it away. So then I think nobody ever gets there. But then when you find it, it's a marvelous thing, isn't it? In Portugal, as I was talking, this is one of the projects on the other side of the River Taar. The Tejo, which is a small poor fisherman's town, and there they made this wooden structure where they have a library for the children of the village. They have a bicycle repair shop, because somehow every temporary structure needs to have a bicycle repair shop. And but they also hired one of the people from the village to cook for the people that got there. And they go to the markets every day to gather all the leftovers from the markets that makes the ingredients for the food. So just because it's only 15 minutes per person, so I have to rush on a bit. But you could say that all these temporary lights, small structured projects are relating to public space. They're kind of pragmatic, but also innovative and really committed, I think. And there you can see. If you want to apply more words than just reactivate a public space, or all the other keywords that come in, I have collected quite a lot of them. With all of them, coming to the fact that that the city planning as such has become outdated, that the role of the government is changing, that generic models no longer right, and that we have to look for other ways of design incentives to try and make more projects that are more into cooperation, or to get, and then we're getting it's kind of your theme as well, isn't it? That it's in circular systems, that if it's no longer about just being sustainable, just being climate neutral, it's much more about finding whole new ways of combining circles and closing circles. And that's getting really, really difficult. I'll leave it, but then I get into the circular metabolisms and the urban metabolisms and how you can actually combine everything to everything. And well, that's kind of the end of my speech, I think. But would say that we need new political and economic design values, and that it needs to be done now, that nobody has the patience to actually do it. So you look for small projects you can start today, and I think that's what also many of you are actually doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Indira. We appreciate a lot your work, the activate and the examples that you gave us. Allora, Marco Poletto teaches at Bartlett University. He's part of the group Ecological with Claudia Basquero, and they deal with between biologic, nature, new shapes, a lot of things. The key word is collective intelligence. Intelligenza collettiva.
Thanks, Luigi, and thanks for your team. It's really nice to be here in this wonderful place and to join this interesting list of speakers. I deliberately choose for today a term, collective intelligence, which is kind of related to the realm of science most commonly, but that I would argue is being interpreted, and I think it's about time it gains new meanings. And what we're trying to do in our lab in Bartlett, the Urban Design Lab and in Ecologic Studio, is really trying to engage with science in a different way, or to, let's say, reinterpret the kind of absolutist truths that normally we associate with science, scientific methods, and engage with it, I would say, in a speculative manner. Yes, but I just want to have a new video now, just for starting, which is this one. Actually, you can see maybe the net with that. This file is working.
No.
I have to hear the sound for a second, then I talk about it. So this video is just a little extract from a piece that we produced for the FRAC collection in Japan. And it's a small folly that is inhabited by 300 little digital crickets. The drawing, maybe you can just about see it, describes the components of the pavilion. And these are some of the features. Crickets emit this characteristic noise by friction, by stroking these little hairs one against the other. In our pavilion, we actually use piezo speakers, little discs of ceramic that deform when current goes through them. And this deformation creates a little sound wave, which you eventually hear. Crickets also have different sides, which obviously create different tones. That's a concept. In our case, we have a little perspex tube fixed on top of the piezo buzzer to stimulate this effect. The triangle speakers created a swarm. They were connected to a processing hub at the base. There were 6 of them. And each of them actually was connected to a little sensor you see on the left, which would perceive the presence of visitors and communicate that to the swarm. And the swarm would respond. The response was actually quite simple. Just a little change in rhythm, a shift in the waves would create infinite patterns of sound. The difference was created because each speaker had a position in the pavilion, and the position was computed, was translated into strings of numbers, and these strings of numbers, through a specifically designed code, was translated into a pattern of sounds. And the pattern of sounds was interpreted by visitors and would then send signals back to the system and so on. So the idea is that obviously this was an experiment in collective intelligence, if you want, but at the same time without a specific goal. It was more about creating the opportunity for a conversation between architecture, space, matter, humans, and machines, which would lead to something perhaps new, perhaps interesting, perhaps not. Quite open in that sense. So collective intelligence has been around for almost 100 years now as a concept, and it's really about the emergence of complex behavior from the interaction of multiple simple units. More recently, with the advent of computation, scientists were able to figure out how it works and actually model collective intelligence. And ants were the first one to be modeled. And the reason for that is because are one of the most extraordinary examples of that. Ants are obviously very simple as individuals, but they are the most advanced society, beside humans, as a collective. They can perform various tasks like agriculture and other things. These are the 4 basic rules which scientists discovered to be at the core of emergent collective intelligence. And the last 2 for me are interesting because they are focusing on the amplification of fluctuations and multiple interactions. So something is interesting is that without multiple exchanges or interactions, and without the amplification of little fluctuations, maybe little mistakes, little errors, there cannot be emergent collective intelligence. And for me, this is interesting because it begins to talk about something which normally it is not associated with science or the way we understand as architects science, which is this element of chance, this element of play, this element of interaction, which is in fact at the core of the emergence of intelligence or the emergence of behavior. These are some simulations which my students and researchers have been running in the lab. And these are some projects in which we have been trying to apply the idea. High five. This is one of the researches we did last year actually in Tunisia. This is an area that sits at the edge of the Sahara and the Mediterranean. It's an area that has been subjected to pressure from desertification and advance of the desert. So it's an agricultural hub that has been suffering for this. So we tried to apply these logics to understand whether we could begin to formulate an urban system that would be able to adapt, would be more resilient to such transition, to such fluctuations. So rather than changing the local system, we try to build in resilience. And obviously we did that through a series of simulations, but also attempting to create a sort of visual representation, morphological representation at the level of the city, but also at the level of the morphology, which in that case was really about manipulation of the landscape, creation of microclimates, pockets in which the extremes of that environment could be mitigated. Going back to our ants, something that is often overlooked is that they are able, with some type of ants, like the leaf cutter ants, they are able to build extremely complex and sophisticated nests. Not only morphologically, but also within the nest. They are creating real agricultural systems. In fact, they harvest fungi that they eat. So they are able to control the temperature and the characteristics of these nests quite carefully. And of course, there is not a single ant who knows how to do that. And this is probably the most fascinating thing. It's an emergent property, which is the function of interaction between them. In ants, happens through the environment. It's called emergent interaction. It happens through the position of pheromones in the environment. So eventually, it's an indirect interaction. The environment is the medium for this. And I will talk a little bit later in which way this becomes interesting for us. These again are some simulations in which we discovered how change in environmental conditions actually affect evaporation rate and as a consequence the emergent morphology. So there is a kind of adjustment of morphology in relationship to the environment which is not direct but is emergent. One of the projects we are working on at the moment with the studio in Bartlett is really related to mining landscape in Arizona. We've been there a few times. There is an area called the Copper Corridor where there are a series of very large abandoned or on the point of being dismissed landscapes. And the idea is how can this landscape be regenerated and obviously remediated, but also articulated in a way that can be perhaps inhabited. These are some of the speculations that emerge out of the application of algorithms, and then these are some of the actual material experiments. So what we're trying to do is to connect digital experimentation with live biological experimentation and feed one to the other in a way that is often unpredictable and open to novelty. And this is one of these little biospheres which we created to grow and to control the growth of these myceliums, which are fungi that remediate the soil at the same time affect the local microclimate. Of course, the idea of emergent buff systems, the ability of create organized buff systems is not new. Engaging architects, urbanists have been engaging with this for quite a while. But recently, again, there's been a kind of renewed interest in looking more in detail how living systems actually do or perform this kind of optimization. And one of the most exciting ones is this weird creature, which is called slime mold. It's an amoeba. In fact, it's made of millions of nuclei which are contained in a single cell wall. And the form of this cell can adapt, can change, and can take the shape that is, let's say, more advantageous for the creature for its survival. And engineers, architects have deployed these, for instance, this is an example, to test, to understand road network, infrastructure networks, to simulate the optimization. I'm already running out of time? 5 minutes, okay, that's so bad. What we're trying to do is to go one step further with that. We want to use the slime mold as a security tool, so not so much to give us the right answer in terms of which one is the optimal network for a particular type of infrastructure, but actually trying to observe how we can begin to play or speculate with this creature in relationship to a particular territory. And what is beautiful is that as you go deeper and you begin to control the behavior of this creature, we discover that actually the way it optimizes is nothing like we imagine. There is no kind of linear, optimal, perfect, precise connection. It's all a kind of crazy meandering. There are all sorts of different zones and pockets emerging, and this can be tweaked, can be played, because we have the possibility now to communicate information to the creature. So you can see this is a case study, which we take a survey map and we use light signals, we use 3D printed landscapes to translate these obstacles into particular stimuli, for example. And in later stages, the animal generates other morphologies which we are understanding. So my discourse here was trying to point out that for us, what is becoming really exciting about these concepts and the way we can play with them right now is not so much that they provide a solution that is true and exact for a particular problem, but they can be used as speculative tools to, in fact, engage problems and shift the way we think about the solution, think about the problems itself. And perhaps this, for us, is not only to be applied at the computational level, but also to question the way we think about space, we think about materiality, we think about interaction between humans and space. So this idea of multiple interaction that we see and observe in the creatures I showed before, we want to translate that into a possibility of remetabolizing, describing the city and its space. So here are just very quickly a couple of slides from a piece we did in Paris, in the Media Foundation. And this, of course, is in the Architectural Association a couple of years ago, and basically are all one before it's a column piece, this one is ceiling, which are embedded with microorganisms, algal microorganisms, which of course can produce energy, food, and nutrients, but also require care, require the interaction of people, perhaps requires a different engagement with the fabric of architecture, the fabric of space. And this is perhaps where this idea of multiple interaction and emerging interaction can be translated. In these experiments, we use QR codes to access what we call the virtual garden, which was in fact a digital virtual space where the visitors and whoever was interested in engaging with this living system could give information, could interact. And this, very briefly closing now, is translating into a bigger project which we are doing in Milan for Expo next year, and it's really about trying to understand how we can perhaps introduce new streams within the city of Milan through this virtual interface and a pavilion which we have unveiled 3 weeks ago. This is the first mock-up, and I leave it with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco, for your keyword. Now is Ilaria Mazzoleni. Ilaria is a teacher at SciArc. She recently wrote a very interesting book on the interrelation between nature and architecture, and her keyword is resilience.
Thank you, Rick. Hello, everybody. I'm pointing to this slide to start. Tell me when mine is of It's all working. Sorry. So yes, my word is resilience, and thank you, Marco, for addressing it earlier. So somehow, yeah. So resilience is the capacity of a system to deal with change and continue to develop. Is it about the capacity to spur renewal and innovation in thinking? Resilient thinking embraces learning that human and nature are strongly coupled to the point that they should be conceived as one social ecological systems. So I like to talk to the ability to deal with change, to evolve and adapt, that we take from nature into the design, into architecture, that brings to our innovative thinking, that deals with performative aspects of designs also, and the fact that from nature we can learn, among other things, that everything is interconnected. So often we talk about systems and not just individual elements. If we look at the Earth as one large ecosystem and we deal with its ecological thresholds, we can connect to all the contemporary subjects of environmental thinking that deals with climate change and all the elements that we recognize about that, and the role of our being in Earth, the eco versus the ecological model, deals also with the fact that we want to deal with robust systems, with systems that build up robustness, and not just thinking that the disappearance of one species does not connect to our own well-being on the planet. So thinking system is a changing paradigm, and the fact that we are all interconnected is really fundamental to us. And the other element of resilience is nature, is this idea of regrowth, of spur new growth that is cyclical, and if it's robust enough, the system, there is a way back to it. So that are the first elements of resilience in architecture, when we think that it can be adaptable, innovative, and flexible, if we look at these elements. So thinking about adaptation and how we deal with the evolution and adaptation taken from nature, we can think of living organisms as one element where the skin is the largest organ in our body, and it connects with the inner body, but also the larger system of the environment. And through the characteristics of the skin, some of which may be thermoregulation, water balance, protection, communication, we can build an analogy that is not morphological, but is deals with the performance of our systems. And we can connect to, for example, the design of one element in architecture, which is the envelope. So an example for thermoregulation may be the polar bear and how it has adapted to the extreme conditions of the cold. And it does that through the insulations of the fur that has is hollow, and it helps connect to and conduct the heat to the black skin and stored into the fur, and together with a behavioral adaptation, which is the one of the den. So these two components, a physiological and a behavioral adaptation, bring you to the design of a proper architecture, of a conceptual development of a design of a compact unit that uses the thermal mass of the Earth, and it has a building envelope that tracks the movement of the sun, so to absorb the heat into the envelope and slowly releases into the environment. And in doing that, starts to build a system that deals with the local conditions. This innovative way of looking at designing buildings or performance aspects that deals also with the formal, but starts from its performance, brings to a design methodology that looks at form with function, and it builds interdisciplinarity where the diversity of stakeholders brings scientists into the design team. And the change of scale is possible when we think at the envelope as a threshold that connects the inside and the outside world, and we can scale it to the ecosystem level. So what it works at the element level in architecture may work also at a larger scale if thought in continuity. So the second project is a model community, is an ideal competition that deals with the design of a community or a housing for 1,000 people, but in order to satisfy that, it has to build the entire ecosystem that deals with the ecological footprint of 1,000 people. And it does that through the build of a team of people that also work together in a horizontal manner, not seeing anymore the designer as the leading figure, but the team together with the biologists and the agronomists are designing the space. And this competition was done in Salton Sea. It's an artificial lake located in Southern California and is in the desert, but the use of the water of the Colorado River allows the traditional forms of agriculture to develop in its south and north shore. And so by studying the ecology of the soil, the earth and the water and air of the area, we saw how complex and yet how thick is the place. In fact, all the fish that are in this salty water that collects all the runoff of the agricultural lands are dealing with a cycle of death. So how do we take an ecology that has such intense problems and we deal in order to create an ecology of life is through designing not just the community, the housing for the people, but taking their ecological footprint and designing 3,000 to 100 acres of land that develops all the systems that are necessary for the building to and the people that live there to sustain their lives. So it's the development of all the energy systems that are producing positive outputs of energy, all the agricultural land that deals with desert climates, and other functions for the scientists and people that coming from San Diego and from the biotech industry can live in these environments. So in looking at revealing the potential of the environment, the architecture of the 21st century is called for a resilient, interconnected interplay with nature and with the sun. I close. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilaria. So we have reactivated public space, collective intelligence, resilience. The fourth speaker is Lola Shepherd. Lola Shepherd is the partner of Lateral Office, and she is the curator of the Canadian Pavilion. Lola is here. I have a keyword is adaptation. So the floor is yours, please.
tornare
Hello, thank you for having me. I think I may have been ambitious in the number of images I'm going to try and squeeze in here. So my keyword is adaptation, although I may try and sneak in a second one called speculation. Really, partly I think there's a kind of interesting debate happening in architecture right now as to what determines the kind of core or fundamentals and what determines the periphery. And this is obviously the question at the table today, and it's actually the question being tabled at the next ACSA conference, which I'm working on. And I think there's this sort of constant pull between architecture's kind of desire to engage a kind of expanded territory and look to other disciplines. And I think there have been some great presentations, which I'm very sympathetic to, that look to ecology, to biology, to science, to sociology, and so forth. And then at the same time, a question of what remains the kind of center of the discipline, and can one innovate from the inside of the discipline or only from the outside? And I guess there's this sort of great quote from Beatrice Gomina, who wrote a text in 2012 on radical pedagogies, where she talks very much about this idea, highly self-conscious architectural radicalism of the second half of the century revealed the anxieties caused by the discipline's awareness of its indeterminate identity in a transformed world. Architectural practice, the question of architectural sociopolitical efficacy in the light of its complicity with capital, came to the fore, and the discipline was forced to examine the margins of its own disciplinary protocol. While some forms of radical practice celebrated architecture's integration into a larger cultural milieu, others responded with a retreat to an investigation of formalism. And I guess I would argue that I think really architecture's sort of future radicalism and actually present radicalism lies not so much in leading the discipline, but in really engaging what we started to talk about in our office as extrinsic architecture, the sort of forces that actually shape architecture, whether it be political, environmental, social, or cultural, and that in engaging those in a kind of significant way, they actually push back at the discipline to be sort of far more radical than perhaps the kind of interior of the discipline might push us to, or to perhaps push us to sort of surprising places. And so I think however to kind of engage these questions, it also requires perhaps a kind of different kind of practice, one which is heavily rooted in research as a kind of precursor to design, and one which perhaps actually begins with research in things outside of architecture to then question back how we design and conceive of things. So speculation is a set of ideas or guesses about something that is not known. It is an activity in which someone buys or sells something in the hope of making a large profit at the risk of a large loss. And I think this idea that speculation sort of takes you outside your comfort zone and into sort of things that we don't actually know is both sort of daunting but actually quite interesting. And so we started to think a lot about what is the role of the architect. There's been the architect as artist, there's been the architect as scientist. I think in the kind of era of climate change, there's also a little bit the idea the architect is superhero who will somehow, through various projects, deal with rising tides or floods or so forth. And I say that, with both humor but also sympathy to that impulse. I think a kind of interesting model for the architect is the one of detective. And we've spent a fair amount of time thinking about, what kind of detective one might be. and I apologize if these are very North American references, but there's Colombo, who's an interesting model because he doesn't so much. The program always started with you knowing exactly who had done it, and so the question wasn't who done it, but how to kind of find out what were his methods for uncovering that. And so I think the question of methodology behind detective work is very interesting. There's Magnum PI, who we contemplated but decided was a bit too suave and made it seem too effortless, and we decided architecture wasn't quite that effortless. And then sort of Cagney Lacey, the idea of sort of team that sort of takes on multiple roles. But the one we sort of landed on is perhaps the ideal model of the architect detective is Lester Freeman from which I'm not sure Europeans know, but he sort of starts his career in the basement, having been relegated from detective work for having asked difficult questions, and basically sees his career resuscitated during the show because of his great detective work. And he famously says, you follow the drugs, you get the drug addicts and the drug dealers, but you follow the money and you don't know where the ethic will take you. And I think this idea of following the money and not knowing where it will take you is actually key. That one asks questions and look at things that one may not be able to anticipate the results, but that one at the same time sort of stumbles upon very interesting phenomena. And so partly I would argue that tools for perhaps speculating for a new kind of architecture, I would possibly give 5 ideas. The first is the idea of scalable territories, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but it's really this idea that architecture until now has largely thought about its sort of zone of engagement as being the site, and yet I think many architects are interested in landscape architecture and urbanism and ecology and so forth, and if we're really going to engage those disciplines, then we need to start looking at a kind of much more expanded scope of engagement that really looks no longer at site, but at a kind of much larger territory. The second is the idea of complex stakeholders, that we are not only, and I think the previous presentations touched on this as well, that are kind of the people we are agents for is perhaps not only humans, but also species, ecologies, and so forth. The third is the idea of fluid envelopes. This idea that the kind of notions of interior and exterior might be challenged, the ideas of benign comfort that architecture sort of typically, we are told that an interior space should be 21 degrees at a certain humidity, could be challenged. The idea of a kind of expanded performance, that it is not only about a kind of technical sustainability in the sense of LEED and so forth, but a kind of expanded social, cultural and economic sustainability of projects, which ties into a kind of last idea, which is that of entrepreneurial architecture, that architecture might produce things beyond itself immediately and actually produce microeconomies, bring in programs that were kind of previously unthought of. So I'm going to spend a moment on site and the idea of site, territory, and geography, and then hopefully get into a few more images. So I think I spent a fair amount of time thinking about this question of site. There's a kind of a way of analyzing site. There are many ways of analyzing site, I should say. So there's a kind of GIS model, which is both very powerful, but perhaps also limiting, in that it allows one to understand the systems that operate on the site, but it perhaps denies the fact that sites are actually many nested, many sites of nested scale. So the kind of territory and boundaries of hydrology will be entirely different than the boundaries of toxicity or demographic systems or political boundaries. And so that a kind of site may actually have multiple boundaries depending on what you're looking at. So second idea is that, once you blow up in the question of site versus territory, and you start to say, for instance, you look at the forces of globalism or capitalism, and this is a map of Walmarts in North America. What is the site of a Walmart? Is it the actual building? Is it the network of distribution centers and highways that support it? So site becomes, I think, ambiguous. When you look at questions of ecology, so for instance, this is a map of toxicity of arsenic in the US. Your site may be one thing, and yet the source of toxicity or the source of water may be completely off your site. And then coming back to this idea of alternate species, And all of this is tied, you'll see, because we're looking at a lot of work in the north where scale becomes blown open. So this is mapping caribou migration in northern Alaska, and so of course the territory in which species operate is entirely different than the territory in which humans might operate. And so I think that I'm going to sort of rush through this, but the idea of cartography becomes important, of how we map it, how we manage this kind of vast amount of information that is available to us today. So of course Fuller, not only developed the Maximus map, but also looked at the way in which, depending on how you project information, it completely changes your reading. So the first, he leaves land intact and water takes up the distortions of mapping, and in the bottom is the inverse. And so the idea that how you manage that information starts to become a kind of tool of constructing an argument and leading towards design. I'm going to actually skip over this, but so this is the kind of legacy of course, well, the legacy of GIS is partly Ian McCard and later James Corner, who did some remarkable work in terms of thinking about larger landscapes and the kind of systems that that kind of operate on them. But a kind of second idea or perhaps a kind of alternate idea of thinking about site and territory is what I'm calling the epigenetic territory. And it's actually co-opting Sanford Quinter in his text Soft Systems, borrows a kind of idea from Waddington, who was a biologist, who was looking at how DNA starts to kind of act, acts as a kind of response system within the body. So these are the drawings actually by Waddington, where he looks at the idea that the kind of epigenetic surface is a sort of responsive surface, that there are forces below the surface that transform and the surface, and then in turn the kind of ball, which is wandering above it, is also sort of giving a feedback mechanism. So the idea that the site is both influenced by forces, but also feeds back, that those forces start to shape the site is important. So for us, the Canadian North has become a kind of interesting test site. It's, of course, a kind of landscape that is that is vast and sublime and somewhat mythic. It's also a kind of region that is undergoing dramatic transformations with the potential for oil and natural gas, and also dramatic transformations due to climate change. And we have a Prime Minister who is also asserting sort of sovereignty issues in the Canadian Arctic, although it's not really clear who's going to debate us, because it's pretty hard to debate. It makes for good political rhetoric. And so you've got a series of highly dispersed small settlements. You have only 100,000 people living in 3.5 million square kilometers. So we're talking about, the two biggest communities are 10,000 and 20,000, and you quickly drop off to a few thousand or a few hundred. So the kind of challenges to architecture become huge. You've also got a very young population. So this is kind of some prototypical plans. We've documented most of the communities in the north to give you a sense. And there's this kind of remarkable landscape. These are taken from Nunavut. And you've also got a kind of reality on the ground in terms of urbanism, that very little thought has been given to architecture and planning. And yet at the same time, there's sort of amazing experiments in the 70s, both problematic but fascinating, about how architecture might react to the environment. So I want to actually jump ahead, but I think this idea of detective sort of starts to say, how do we engage a kind of territory this large and this complex? And so we've been working on a book which will hopefully make it onto the shelves during the Biennale, which starts to sort of look at different ways that the architect might start to understand the environment. So for instance, how do you understand sea ice? How do you even define the territory? So for instance, there are multiple definitions by different geographers based on tree line, ethnic regions, permafrost regions, which is the condition of frozen ground, ecologies, road access, the idea that there's a middle north, a far north, and an extreme north. So even defining the north becomes a kind of fascinating problem. So these are the kind of multiple norths that exist within Canada. So, sorry, that's a bit out of order, but this idea that sea ice needs to be mapped and how you understand it, and how, for instance, the Inuit might understand sea ice and record it versus how scientists map it and record it. How, for instance, the military has marked a presence in the north through a set of stations that appear as dots on the map, but also have a kind of very real physical presence on the ground. And how do you document them, and what questions do they ask to architecture? How does the highway work? How is it built and maintained in this kind of dramatic landscape? You know, how is it co-opted for other purposes? What ecologies does it travel through? And I'll just show two more, and then I'll close up. But how things are delivered to the north. So there are boats. So the only way you get things is by boat. If you're bringing building materials, for instance, and by plane if you're bringing people or food. So the kind of logistical challenges of, you know, if you miss a screw in your building, that's it. You pretty much wait. Well, a screw you can fly in. If you miss your gypsum count, you're bringing it in the next year. Or how communities grow and the kind of radical transformation in 50 years that they've undergone. So I think this, you know, to kind of tie back perhaps speculation and adaptation, I think this question of how an architect kind of engages complex questions, requires alternate methods of research, and perhaps also asks that we ask new questions, that we look outside the discipline to actually then come back to innovate within the practice.
Lola, and now from Canada to the far Auckland in New Zealand, Alessandro Melis is there. Alessandro. No. Ah, the keyword. Allora. He's sorry.
Thank you. Melis from New Zealand sounds a little bit weird. Okay. So, my keyword is soil, and I understood that the word should be chosen on the basis of the idea that we have the future of architecture, of the future in general. So soil for me is the most meaningful word for our future development. Let's say we have to clarify what is our scope. In a very simple way, just before the American Constitution, happiness is our scope. How can we create, how can we improve the happiness of the people? So this is our main scope. And of course, it's very difficult to try to give a precise definition of this, because it's not material matter, happiness. But let's say that the United Nations tried an initiative scientific definition of this. Till the 80s, the main idea was that richness was the way of measure happiness. So let's say that the internal product per capita was the measure of happiness. So let's say that especially trying to make a ranking of the nations, the happiest nations were the one with the highest richness. Of course, we realized that it was not enough. And as I said, United Nations tried to create different approaches to this definition. How we can define happiness in a, let's say, more scientific way. And United Nations developed the HDI index, which is called the Human Development Index. Let's say that they wanted to understand that richness, but also healthiness, and also culture were basic aspects of our happiness. And of course, to simplify, I think we just used three aspects of this definition. So for the richness, we use the internal product. For healthiness, we use the expectancy of life. And for culture, we use the literacy rates. And on this base, the United Nations define a series of rankings that are changing every year. But let's say for a certain period, this ranking was quite rigid. Was not changed. Then we realized that, let's say, at the end of the 80s, as everybody knows, with the understanding that the limited resources of our planet were impacting too much these effects. So we understood that happiness was going to change for the future generations. So this ranking was not enough to understand this. So there are many researchers trying to define a different approach to this issue, and let's say the most famous one, as you know, is related to the European agenda, and before the European agenda, before the European agenda, the Puntland report, very famous and very discussed, the idea of sustainable development. So this means that United Nations was trying to develop a new idea to clarify that HDI should be also need to be sustainable as well. And the index that has been used is the CO2 emissions as a parameter. Unfortunately, this ranking was never went through, and was never possible to substitute this ranking with the previous one. So still now we use the Human Development Index to define this aspect of our global society. But as you can see, if you watch the two rankings, you immediately realize that there is something which is changing. Some nations are staying in the same position, some other nations are changing their position. And as you can see, there is kind of polarization. So from the thing that is mostly changing from the two rankings is the fact that with the Human Development Index, still the richness and the quantity of use of energy is one of the main items to be at the top of the ranking. And with the Sustainable Development Index, we realize that nations which have, can say, a more bigger awareness about the use of energy are increasing their position. At a certain point, it's actually become quite a discussion about the definition of sustainability. Everybody is discussing this term, and let's say, both in a positive and a negative way, as a trend or as a mantra, or as a obligation, or as a sacrifice. But what I find interesting in this diagram, this chart, is that whatever you want to in any way you want to define the sustainability, you have to be aware of the fact that not necessarily this means sacrifice. It could become somehow something that could improve our quality of life. As you can see, if you compare the energy use and the life expectancy, you realize that there are three different groups of nations. And life expectancy is not corresponding to the nation that, in the ranking that I mentioned before, are the richest nation. So there is kind of changing in the life expectancy in the nations that have more qualified use of energy. So this means that the use of energy somehow this is in our research that we're doing in our department in the University of Oakland is one of the elements that we use also to prove, to show that what we need to do is not to think of the use of energy, so the emission of CO2 as a negative aspect of our future, but let's say we have to think about this as an opportunity. Probably we need more idea how to deal with this, but surely this is not going to be our problem in terms of sacrifice. Here you can see that the aspect of expectancy of life is always going to become kind of better index in, as I said, the country that are using in a better way the energy, the resources. Of course, there are let's say, 4 big groups of nations. Let's say the nations, the poor nations that, of course, are in any case at the bottom of this ranking. This is something that we have to think about. A group of nations that are at the top of the ranking, as we said, there's a kind of more balanced use of energy, and in the middle we have the energy eater nations that are mostly done by the states that are producing oil, and let's say the richest nations like the United States, Australia, and Canada. But why we are all thinking about the CO2 emission? What I find very interesting while we do the research, especially in the academic work, is that everybody discussing this topic, but again it's not clear to everybody why we are doing this. What is the problem with the CO2 emissions? Most of the answer that I receive usually about this is because the comfort is going to change in the future, because the pollution is a problem, is another problem, or many other responses. But really what is not clear to everybody, this is why I need to point this out at this moment, is that the fact that the main problem is the lack of soil. So the only reason, the main reason why we are all afraid of the CO2 emissions is the fact that in an indirect way, this is causing a lack of soil for the future in the next 50 years, and we are facing this condition. We also have to start from the idea that we are living in a 7 billion community, and already now we have 1 billion people that are living under the average level of nutrition. And we are all aware that from the most optimistic statistics that we will have an increase of 2 billion people within the next 20 years, which means an increase of 20% of our population. And at the same time, this means that we will need somehow to feed this population. And as I said, since we are still today under the average level of nutrition for 1 billion people, this means that we will need at least 20% more of soil for the future to feed the 20% more people that we will have on our planet. And this is already something that could be already scary, but this is not all, because as we said, global warming is a machine that is driving the reduction of the soil. And how it is doing, how this machine is working is here, you can see. So at the moment, we are using almost all the amount of soil that we have, 98%, for production. The available soil means that we are talking about the soil that is out of the ocean and is not in a desert, is not glaciers, is not forests. So, sorry, finish? No. Almost. Here, as you can see, is the future picture. So we will have an increase of the oceans, an increase of the city population. We have an increase of the need of agricultural space, agricultural surface. We have an increase of desert, and so on. So we will arrive in a positive projection where a lack of, let's say, 11.4% of land surface that we will miss for the future. Not considering, this is not considering the 20% population that we will have more than today, and not considering the fact that, as I said before, we have 1 million people that still today don't have enough to eat. So let's say that for the future, the use of soil is one of the main events that we have to consider. And if we start from the assumption that at the moment, from our research in New Zealand, we know that 50%, minimum of 50% of the CO2 emission depends on the construction field in a different way. But let's say that also the rest depends on the construction field. So the whole part is very strategic. What this means is that probably in the future we will have the need of a different approach to the city, a different approach to architecture, different means of strategies. And because we will need more food, we will have bigger cities, we will have ocean, we will have desertification. And what we need is more radical concept, because we have interaction area from these different territories, more resilience, more high density. And at the moment, if we just put this in mathematics, we don't know how to solve this problem. This is why, from my perspective, also considering that this 50% that we are talking, 50% of architecture that today is causing CO2 emissions, the majority of the CO2 emissions is depending on the way that we define architecture and planning in the last years. I would say that it's, from my perspective, fundamentals, not only because of the sound that sounds a little bit very close to fundamentalism, but also because it depends on what we mean. Because of course, if we need radical concept like basic resilience, it means that we have eventual needs of this very radical approach. So we don't need to come back to some kind of history, because we have to face and also adapting climate conditions, where we have, I don't know, a condition like Oslo having the same temperature Berlin, Oakland is having the same temperature of Sydney, but with also major problems. And so this is, I would say that this is the final goal of the discussion. We need to radical concept, and if we want to come back to the fundamentals, we have to understand what we mean for this. I just show briefly. A short video which is just a trailer of the research that we are developing in Oakland. It's going to define new models of the house and take into consideration this happening.
Surface waters are being polluted and realigning our environmental practices. For 40,000 gallons per second, and depends where the extraction
Agricultural changes in temperature and rainfall patterns could lead to food price rises of between 3% and 84% by 2050.
Climate change is already affecting food supply.
children, Alessandro, Mira came from Netherlands, Marco from England, Daria from Los Angeles, Lola from Canada, Alessandro from New Zealand, and now Carlo Ratti from USA. He teaches at MIT University and is a well-known architect.
Thank you.
And then we will have a short break. The keyword. The keyword is living architecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Luigi. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. What I wanted to do, we've all been to the Biennale. We've all seen the fundamentals exhibited by architecture and window doors. And so I think it's very interesting also to look at some structure in a very clear representation. But it's very interesting to look at many advancements of architecture actually extending into other disciplines, into other dimensions. So what I decided to do actually today, I prepared a different presentation today. But I decided to do something a bit different and almost look at the dimension that's very non-traditionally architecture. It's more about mobility, how we can capture mobility in our space, in our cities, in a different way, and how this can actually help us then design it differently. I wanted to start with this picture. This picture used to be really fascinating in the 1990s. They thought that our world would become increasingly virtual, so the physical would be less and less important. So much so that many people, including Gilder, in the 1990s, wrote and thought that cities would disappear. Gilder identifies that we are headed for the death of cities. Well, the first thing this tells us is that it's quite tough to predict the future. It's almost impossible to predict the future. This poor guy made this prediction like 20 years ago, now everybody's saying, how wrong we were. Because cities have been thriving over the past 20 years. The picture of China this century will probably build more urban fabric than all of humanity ever built. We know we have 50% of the population of the planet now living in cities, and this number will actually swell to 5 billion by 2030. So what is happening is that all those things that Gilder and many other people thought would kill the need for physical space and the need for cities, actually didn't do so. But at the same time, they changed our interaction with physical space. So the digital didn't kill physical space, but actually it's creating a new hybrid condition. The condition is in between digital and physical, it's in between bits and atoms, with us in the middle. And what I want to do is actually show you a few examples of this. The examples in the thing we try to do both at our lab at MIT and in Boston and Singapore and in our design office in Korea, London, and in Boston, is actually to look at this and not try to predict what things will be tomorrow. You cannot. As we saw with Gilder, you cannot. This is actually a picture from the Boston Globe, the last day of 1899, so just before 1900, they tried to predict how life would be in 2000, and everything was really screwed up. They didn't really find one prediction. So we're not trying to do it. We're trying to do how we can actually together explore new potentials in the interactions between us and the environment, us and what is out there. And in particular, what we're showing now is potentials about understanding flows in the city. So it's about sensing the city, collecting information, and accurately responding to that information. First project I want to show you is deliberately picked projects that are very non-architectural in a traditional sense, but really that can give us a knowledge of space that then we can turn into architecture later. In this project, we started with this computer. Now, if you take this computer, we know everything about it. Every chip in the computer, you know what it was produced, how it moved on the planet, how it became that machine. However, years from now, we stop using this computer, you know little about it. Sometimes this is what happens to it. It goes to developing countries, where it shouldn't go, it's used, the same way in the wrong way. So we asked, how could we better understand what is going on? So we decided to say, well, what if you put a little chip on trash and start following trash? In the same way, we put, in the blood, when you go to hospital, they put a tracer in your blood and they follow it through your body. How do we do the same thing at the scale of an entire city? Well, we couldn't find a type, so we had to design a type. It's almost like designing a miniature of cell phone. And then we put it on trash. This is the first big comment we did.
in the city of Seattle. We had 3,000 pieces of trash and 500 volunteers. Incidentally, we were camping in the library in Seattle. So all these people were carrying 3,000 pieces of trash, and everybody was in the library was terrified. And after putting a little time on each of them, we started throwing them. That's the daily comment. After a few days, you see some of the trash that goes to some of the landfills next to Seattle. But then being surprised how far things started to travel. Sometimes in a crazy way. Look at the trace that went all the way to Chicago and down to Baja California. And it's been moving after 1 month or 2 months. Yeah, couldn't think of better music than the Farewell Symphony by Haydn. So what do you do with this? If you're an engineer, if you are an architect as well, you've got all this information, then you use it to design a better system. Think about how much energy is wasted in the system that you actually could save, actually do that in a better way. And nobody so far has actually traced the whole system. People usually trace just a small chunk of the system, but without, everybody knows a small piece of it, but this was using the guys the ability to trace all of it from beginning to end. The second thing that's very important is that if you got this information, you can then ask yourself, well, what if you share it with people? And then people can take this information and respond to it in a way that changes their behavior. It's the domain of big data. In big data, that everybody is talking about in the industry, can also change a lot of architecture. Big data means we know about our cities an incredible amount of things. Just to give you an example, if you take all the information that was produced by humanity from the beginning to 2003, you take all the data, that's the same amount of data that we produce now every 24 to 48 hours. The quality is not the same, but sheer amount is the same. So if you do this and share it with people, then they can actually help change everybody's behavior in the building, in the city. Somebody came to us at the end of the project and said, I used to drink water in plastic bottles. Then throw them away, forget about them. And now after the project, and only go a few months from home to a landfill and stay there forever. So I stopped drinking water in plastic bottles. The final thing I want to share with you with this project is actually at the end of the project, after the project, a burglar came to our lab at MIT. And the poor guy stole a lot of things, including some of the tags, and the computer will tell you where they go. And this is what happened. Alright. Okay, well, this is about sensing even trash, but you can sense so many things. We are working, for instance, in order to use DNA scanning of the city, using DNA scanning of genomics in sewage in order to better understand what you could call the biome of the city. In Hong Kong, just a couple of months ago, we've been working, and actually that was a change in the Hong Kong Biennale, that is becoming a bigger project, actually to monitor air quality. People themselves can monitor air quality and use this data in order to take political and civic action. This is a video. you can actually show you're crossing the border. So two cities very close but with very different air quality. And you see by the color, red is a lot of pollution, as you see there. That's the crossing border. You see actually how red it gets on the other side of the border in mainland China. And so in the last 5 minutes I have, I want to share with you actually how we can use all of this. This is all information we collect from sensor, but we can use a lot of this to better understand mobility and perhaps how this will change mobility over the next few years. The first thing I want to show you is the project is one of the oldest projects we did, but it still shows sometimes, especially in Italy, and now that the software workout is starting. This was actually the first time ever that we used data from millions and millions of cell phones in the city of Rome to look at how the city behaves. This is a very special day when Italy and France in 2006 were playing the finals of the World Cup and Italy won. That's the beginning of the World Cup, Italy scores, halftime, people make a call, then people play, in silence, nobody talks, second of overtime, first overtime, second of Brazil, and the headbutting moment, and then Italy wins. Right. So you can really understand the city like this, you can understand it like this. There's another project in Lisbon by Pedro Cruz was in our lab. That's data from billions of data points from the taxis. So almost understanding the city is something lived, something alive. And then you can get it and ask yourself different questions. This is New York. What you see here is actually the airport in New York. You see every taxi pick up and drop off in yellow in a group. Then you ask yourself, well, you can see them across all the city, and then what if people could actually share a taxi? You couldn't do it a few years ago, but now you can, because you got real-time information in your pocket. In the same ways, most of us are actually here in Venice using Airbnb, which is a way to share an apartment. The same you can do with sharing a car, a taxi, or many other things in our life. And something wasn't possible before because the lack of information is becoming possible today. So we then asked ourselves mathematically, what if we can actually quantify this? How many trips could we reduce if people were ready to share? And what you find is quite extraordinary. You see in these graphs, you could actually run New York City with more or less 50% of the taxis you have today, still taking everybody to the destination when they need to be here. And if you combine this with another great change that's about to come, and that is self-driving cars, so the city is becoming more intelligent, the car is becoming more intelligent. As you know, Google has developed one, MIT has developed one, our Volkswagen has many companies and universities around the world are working on self-driving. The technology is there, you find them on the road every day, so it's a matter just of deployment. Actually, Audi wants to introduce self-driving as early as 2018. But self-driving is interesting, not because you need to keep your hands on the steering wheel, not because you don't need to, you can shamelessly text while driving. But self-driving is interesting because then everything changes in urban mobility. The car, your car, can give you a lift in the morning to work, and then can give you a lift to somebody else in your family, or anybody else in the city. So what you're doing, you're totally blurring the distinction between public transportation and public transportation. So if you do that, we did a calculation, you could run a city such as New York, or a city such as Singapore with 20% of the vehicles you have today. It's the combination of self-driving with what we saw before, which is the ability to share. So potentially, you could take everybody to the destination, no traffic jam, with 20% of the vehicles that you have today. And we've got 1 minute more I want to share with you. Then if you do this, if you think then when everything is self-driving, you can think about a different type of city. A city, for instance, where you don't need traffic lights anymore. You can have something like this. Don't try it yet. I was in Naples the other day, actually, told me, well, we know how to do this. What's new here? And that becomes much more efficient. And the final project I want to share with you in a minute is actually deals with bicycles. So we started working with the city of Copenhagen about bicycles. We developed this prototype called the Copenhagen Wheel. And I think this is something that's very important to all of us as architects, engineers. How do you then bring the project in product? How do you do it? And more, we are seeing startups that emerge from ideas that are developed in the lab or in our office. In this case, it became a startup. It's called Super Pedestrian, Rossi called it, and here is the idea. It's actually developing a wheel. It's put an air bicycle and we make it turn it into a hybrid electric bicycle with a lot of data.
This is the Copenhagen wheel. It turns your ordinary bicycle into a smart electric hybrid by simply replacing your back wheel. Connect it to your smartphone, download the app, and you're ready to go. Bicycles are a great way to move around, yet sometimes distances are too long. Hills can get in the way, and hard journeys to work may leave you covered in sweat. The Copenhagen wheel is here to change all that. The technology was developed over several years at MIT, together with the city of Copenhagen, one of the world's most innovative places for cycling. Its original inventors licensed the technology and founded Super Pedestrian, the startup where we are now working around the clock to bring the wheel to you. Like the best riding companion, the Copenhagen wheel learns how you pedal and integrates seamlessly with your motion. It captures your energy when you brake or go down a hill, and gives you a push when you need it, with 3 to 10 times your regular foot power. It's easy, ride it just like a normal bike. As you pedal, the motor automatically kicks in, with no additional throttles or buttons. All technology for the Copenhagen wheel is contained in the red casing, including motor, removable batteries, wireless connectivity, smart locking, multiple sensors, and an embedded control system. Use your smartphone to customize your ride, monitor your physical activity, gather information from your environment to share with your friends and fellow cyclists. And if you're a software developer, you can even create your own biking apps. So whether you carry yourself, your kids, or your gear, hills seem flat, distances shrink, and you can cycle just about anywhere. So transform your bike and transform the city. The Copenhagen wheel.
One of the things is this, because as architects engineers, we're often frustrated with the clients we have. Luis Bargan, the great Mexican architect, he used to say, when he was 50, 55, he'd say, I'm tired, so I don't want to work with people who tell me what to do or should do with clients. From now onwards, I will have only my one client myself. And he could do because we could make a lot of money before. But then we have another option, this option actually to find our own clients on the net, to actually go on Kickstarter and let people order this or the products that we design. And I think that's something that's going to be more and more exciting as we move forward. Thank you.
Allora, now a short break, a 15-minute break, and then we start again with more speakers.
Dov'è? Quindi? Ok. Io confermo. Ho detto c'è io.
Che mi ha scriveva a me, posso fare quello perché sono andata fuori, quando mi sono andata fuori, guarda che stavo
Una batteria. Una batteria.
Devo venire illuminato.
Lo so, per questo. 7,5.
Questo è sempre filmato. Allora, tutto a posto?
C'è la quarta presa. Adesso c'è lo streaming, Roberto. Puoi interromperlo e proviamo a scaricare la presentazione da Talia Bue? Lo facciamo tre. Quello che si mangia tutto, quindi lo facciamo.
Sai che c'è? Che se lo interrompo prima, ti ricordi se non dovuto rientrare tutto quanto? Io la abbasso semplicemente, voi perché è molto pesante?
Proviamo a cercare di abbassarla il più possibile, vediamo quanto riusciamo a scaricare.
Allora, vediamo un attimo.
Adesso vediamo.
Io provo a ridurre al massimo. Ok, quasi scarica la banda, quindi c'è tutto questa possibilità.
Ok, allora senti, posso entrare nella mia mail?
Sì.
Facciamo prima, no?
Però non interrompo.
Scusami, come faccio? Dov'è? Qua.
Sì.
Entro dalla mia mail, giusto? No? Come si esce? Oddio, non è possibile.